All right, folks, I'm going to get started. Hi there. My name is Matthew Saunders, and I've known since I was small that I was different. We didn't call it neurodivergence back then or learning differences. People like me were called learning disabled, and my disabilities were considered bad enough that I was legally entitled to accommodations from the Canadian and Ontario governments where I lived at the time. I've been a part of the Drupal community since 2006. I attended my first DrupalCon in 2007, and I'm one of the founders of this camp, DrupalCamp Colorado. I sat on the Drupal Association Board of Directors for 2.5 years, and I helped found the event organizers working group. I'm a founder and currently the chair for Drupal Colorado Incorporated. That's the nonprofit that runs this camp. And I couldn't believe it. The last DrupalCon that I went to was my 25th. This would be my 15th DrupalCamp Colorado. And I started looking through my badges and so forth. And I think I've been to somewhere in the neighborhood of 170 Drupal events over the last 15 years. I work for Pfizer in digital as a senior management position. So I'm going to give a standard disclaimer. Nothing I talk about here necessarily reflects the opinion of my employers. In 2019, I did a presentation at DrupalCon Amsterdam that touched on my neurodivergence while telling the story of my journey. It was called Pivot Points, Recognizing Opportunity, Turning Challenges into Strengths. I'd spent quite a few years at that point researching my own daughter's challenges. You see, we adopted her from social services at the age of 5. And her experiences before she came to us were traumatic. So I read, I went to classes, seminars, because I needed to understand as much as I could about her own neurodivergence. She has bipolar disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, reactive attachment disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. But what happened during that research was I started having light bulb after light bulb after light bulb going off in my head as I started recognizing more and more about myself. In a very real way, if it hadn't been for my daughter, I would have just continued coping, and I never would have understood my own ADHD and dyslexia. And I certainly wouldn't have had the explosive realization that I was on the autism spectrum. And I figured out most of my coping mechanisms by the time I went to university in 1989. A few I didn't sort out until I had cancer in 2000. But the truth is, I still didn't really understand why I was different until much later. My personal epiphanies occurred between 2005 and 2017. And since then, I've spent time reflecting and refining my own self-understanding. In my Amsterdam presentation, I talked about my journey to being a technology leader despite challenges. And a large reason that my journey was challenging was my lack of diagnosis of cognitive differences. Then I also had a battle with cancer as a young man that profoundly changed the way I see the world. That cancer, in a very strange way, might well be related to my learning differences, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm lucky because my parents saved many of the diagnostic documents that were prepared for me in the 1970s and 1980s. And what this practically means is that I can now use the filter of those documents through the lens of the 21st century. And I'm going to tell you, some of those documents are pretty weird, like looking back at them and the way that things were seen and perceived back then. I also want to say to you, this is my lived experience. I'm giving you insights into what has worked for me and what my primary struggles have been. And while there are recognizable patterns for folks who are neurodivergent, every single one of us is different. That said, I'll try to generalize my observations because the main goal of this talk is to help people who are neurotypical understand atypicals a bit better and provide some insight into how you can better relate and communicate from both a typical and the atypical point of view. As a child, I was diagnosed with a reversal problem with an extremely short attention span, anger issues, and inflexibility. I was labeled as being oppositional. Abrupt sudden noises were and are painful to me, and I experienced sensory overload easily. It was observed that my visual motor integration was poor, And in the 1970s, there wasn't the vocabulary, the sophistication, or understanding to really define my challenges. In today's terms, I would have been diagnosed differently. Dyslexia, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and autism spectrum disorder. I grew up in Canada, and autism wasn't diagnosed there until the 1980s. Even so, I wouldn't have fit that diagnosis for that time period because it was used to describe significant deficits. Asperger's wasn't recognized in Canada until the 1990s. And I would add that when you have multiple disorders, comorbidity can make it difficult to understand what causes what. However, later in my life, one of the mental health professionals that I've worked with said, often it doesn't really matter what the diagnosis is. It's more important to treat the recognizable symptoms. As a side note, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, no longer recognizes the label Asperger's. In 2013, it was removed and folded into the autism spectrum disorder. And I think this is partially because it was discovered that Dr. Asperger played a critical role in identifying children with disabilities during the racial hygiene measures of the Third Reich. Many children were sent to Spiegelgrund in Vienna, where they were sometimes euthanized or used as subjects of experiments. That association has been pretty upsetting to some members of this community. That said, many folks in this community were also highly suspicious when the diagnosis was rolled into the autism spectrum disorder. So this brings me to my first small insight for you. If someone shares with you that they're neurodivergent and describes it as Asperger's, be sensitive to refer to it as such, because that's how they identify. They might also say that they are an Aspie or something like that. Be sensitive to that. Likewise, if they share that they're on the spectrum, there's a good chance that they don't want to identify with the label Asperger's. When I was 3, I had a little red trike. I adored it. And I would beg my parents to put me on the saddle. And once I was sitting on the trike, I would just sit on it and scream. I wouldn't stop. I'd just scream at the top of my lungs. And my parents couldn't figure out why I would just sit there and do it. It took me a year to learn how to ride that little thing. And in 1977, I was identified educationally as a high-risk child due to delays in eye-hand coordination, spatial relations, motor skills, and visual memory. And this was the reason that I would sit and scream. I simply couldn't figure out how to make my legs turn the front wheel. Now, the point to this is that people on the spectrum can anger quickly, and they can have a whole lot of difficulty calming themselves. We need to learn the skills to cope with an increase in irritability. But the first thing that we have to do is identify those emotions. Dr. Kelly Blankenship and Dr. Noha F. Minashawi of the National Library of Medicine wrote, individuals with high-functioning ASDs also exhibit difficulty modulating their anger, which may lead to further difficulties in their social interactions. Because they have difficulty interpreting their own subtle changes in emotion, they are often only able to describe emotional extremes. I simply couldn't express my frustration in a normal way. This led to extreme outbursts. My emotions either seemed elated or they seemed extremely angry. They didn't appear to be much in between. This would continue well into my teenage years, and I had very few friends because of it. They couldn't identify with me. As a young boy, I'd often get into verbal and sometimes physical altercations with my peers, despite being very small for my age. I would become enraged if I felt I was being wronged or insulted. But children are cruel. And rather than trying to help me calm down, they found it funny to wind me up until I was a complete mess. In grades 7 and 8, in an attempt to sort out my learning difficulties, but also cater to my intelligence, I ended up being enrolled in both the gifted and remedial programs at the same time. And this meant I didn't fit in anywhere. I didn't fit in with the gifted because I was in the remedial program. I didn't fit in with the remedial kids because I was in the gifted program. And I didn't have anything in common with any of the kids in normal classes. It was an extremely lonely time for me that ran all the way through high school. And this had social impacts of its own that didn't really resolve until university. However, it did save me from being relegated solely to the remedial program. And this strategy quite likely saved me from a life of being dependent on others. As I got older, I was baffled by how people reacted to me, and I wanted to figure out why I had so much trouble making and keeping friends. What worked for me ultimately was in-the-moment journaling. When I found myself feeling angry, sad, excited, or happy, I would actually just stop, take a deep breath, and look at myself. And I'd identify where those emotions were coming from. I kept a small notebook, and I would journal in it in the moment, because I needed to start understanding cause and effect. I needed to pinpoint why I felt angry, or happy, or sad. And in the last 2 years before going to university, I started being able to identify what self-destructive behaviors around other people actually looked like, and began short-circuiting them rather than using reason rather than using instinct. The social impact of being an experiment by mixing remedial and gifted programs was on its way to resolving by the time I attended university. Because when I arrived, nobody knew who I was, and I realized that I could completely reimagine myself without the stigmas that had built up through middle and high school. At Bishop's University, I learned that you can redefine yourself. You can identify your own, you can create your own identity. I learned that when you're redefining yourself, you can fake it till you make it. That exercise of writing down what I was feeling, when and why, allowed me to flourish both academically and socially during this time. People liked me, and it was perhaps for the first time in my life. I would note that these feelings of anger are nearly never directed personally towards another. And when they fade, and now it happens very quickly, I have no feelings of animosity towards the people that I might have seemed angry with. And this can be very confusing for other people, because they don't understand how someone can 180 so quickly. And it also can be confusing to the neurodivergent person, because they can't conceive why people are still upset with them after they've let go of their irritability. And to this day, my emotions are extreme. I use a variety of self-soothing techniques to smooth out inwardly and outwardly. Sometimes this manifests as box breathing, light tapping on opposite shoulders, repetitive movements, and sometimes using a fidget. So when you work with those on the spectrum, please consider their feelings can manifest differently than yours. They may feel deeply about things that you wouldn't expect. You might be surprised what they feel so deeply about. Please avoid approaching this as overreaction, because that will simply make things more challenging. But none of this makes those feelings less valid or real. For me, I've come to the conclusion that I'm totally fine if someone comes up to me and says, "Hey, what's up? What are you feeling? Why do you feel that way?" And I'm totally happy talking about these things. As long as that feeling isn't dismissed. So if you're in a long-term personal or professional relationship with someone who's neurodivergent, please try to learn what triggers them. Learn what triggers them that leads them to extremes. And you can help an awful lot just by understanding. I experience the same extremes in emotion at the other end too. So I get very irritable, but when I feel joy, it's unbelievably deep. The Asperger Autism Network writes, many feelings such as fear, anger, joy seem to be experienced more intensely by those with Asperger profiles than average people. In addition, some individuals with Asperger's profiles report that they deeply internalize others' feelings. So if someone else is feeling upset, they themselves will quickly become upset as well. I feel joy, like I said, unbelievably deeply. And I remember as a choir boy singing in places like St. John the Divine in New York, feeling like the great maker was filling me. When I visited Coventry Cathedral, the juxtaposition between the bombed out church from the Blitz and the new building that had been purposefully built in integration with the old, well, I was brought to tears. I've been to two DrupalCons in Barcelona and attended the La Mersa festival at both. And at both times, I stood under the street-level fireworks, and it was like I was absorbing joy directly from the lights. Now, I will say both times I was at that festival, it got so unbelievably overwhelming that I did need to get away from it because it was just too much. And then most recently, completely opposite of that festival, I became certified as an open water scuba diver. And I'll tell you, the pure joy that I feel when I'm swimming with turtles and sharks and gliding across forests of coral is all-encompassing. I feel deeply. As a child, it was observed that I had massive vocabulary and excellent word discrimination compared to others in my age group. My verbal IQ was scored in the 99.8th percentile and my over IQ in the 98th percentile. However, traditional learning was very difficult for me and failed. It recommended, this is directly from one of the pieces of paper that I talked about earlier, by the way, the reports that were kept. Treat Matthew as if he were hard of hearing and maintain eye contact while giving oral instructions. And his attention span is so short and he is so easily distracted that it's possible for him to not hear or retain oral lessons. But here's the thing. If you were to sit me down in a music concert, an opera, an operetta, a Broadway show, I would sit quietly until each intermission was done, and then I'd go nuts. And then once we were brought back in, I would watch until the end of the show, consuming every single minute. I was able to pay attention, but not in the ways a teacher in the classroom might desire. My mind was quick to sort out a problem, but I could only focus on one thing at a time, and often obsessively, if it was something that interested me. My handwriting was atrocious. I would scramble letters up. I had a hard time writing letters in the correct direction. And my parents were told to prepare for the fact that I might never learn to read or write. That report of an extremely short attention span, though, wasn't correct. I needed the proper motivation. The obsessive behaviors that can come with those on the autism spectrum when something is interesting made that literacy prediction false. You see, my siblings and my father were part of a church choir that I desperately wanted to be part of. When I was in the second grade, I couldn't read yet. And under normal circumstances, children in the second grade should be able to read 50 to 90 words per minute. The choir master had me read from a hymn book, and I just couldn't do it. He told me that until I could read, I couldn't join the choir. I was inconsolable, and I felt stupid and left out. This turned into fury. It was a red tricycle moment. And it occurred to my mother that they needed to steer that anger towards something more productive. I was fortunate because my father was an English teacher, and he sat down with me every night writing letters, words, then short sentences, long sentences, and eventually short stories on the back of used dot matrix paper. We spent 2 months or so every night after supper drilling. Mom and Dad would actually find me drilling on my own, often forcing me to go to bed crying because I didn't want to stop. But 10 weeks later, I went back to the choir master and asked him to test me again. He was incredulous because I'd done so badly less than 3 months earlier. And I will tell you this, after he tested me, he invited me to join the choir. I had learned to read in less than 70 days, and not only that, I was reading above grade level in both speed and comprehension. This is known as repetitive obsession. Those on the spectrum who find something interesting can learn that thing very quickly if motivated. If you're on the spectrum and have tasks that you're not particularly interested in, something that's worked well for me is to change the rules of the task and turn it into a game. When you're working with somebody on the spectrum, young, old, or in between, a good tactic is to figure out what amuses them, challenges them, interests them. And then they can excel under those circumstances. If a work task is proving difficult to complete, find a way to make the task completely different and fall into something that amuses them. I had behavioral issues, which included some pretty angry outbreaks. And in retrospect, I realized that I was having significant challenges with transitions. I was irritated by unexpected change. when I feel myself tensing up and recognize the fight or flight response occurring over something as unassuming as my wife asking to use my car, or making an unexpected shift in a shopping pattern, or somebody making a completely unexpected change request at work. For me, these things are triggering, and I have to box breathe and ask myself, is it a crisis? Is it a problem? What are the implications if I push back? Before I started engaging in this strategy, my first response would be to argue, which always had negative professional and personal impacts. But it never actually came from a place of trying to be difficult or oppositional. If you work with a person on the spectrum and you see the fight or flight response, you should on something that should be a simple conversation, you should take a breath and ask ask the person, what am I missing? Help me understand the risk here. The moment you do that, you've shifted the context of your conversation. Your friend, colleague, or partner might well go into solutioning rather than defending, explaining rather than fighting. At least that's been my personal experience. Dr. Marcia Eckert wrote on Asperger's 101, before schools and parents and families label behavior problems as oppositional defiant disorder, they need to explore the thinking of the child involved. Though certain explanations of behavior might seem intuitive to the parent or the teacher, this behavior might not be intuitive to the child with ASD or nonverbal learning disorder. Ideally, once the teachers and parents get it, they'll be able to better help provide meaningful explanations and valuable insight instead of creating a negative experience. It takes time, but it's worth it. As a child, I didn't understand consequences. I didn't understand if I did action A, it would lead to consequence B, good or bad. And I still have to think through scenarios so I understand consequences to my actions. This happens incredibly quickly, but I have to think about it. I've intellectualized these responses rather than learned them through osmosis. And I never really realized until adulthood that most people just naturally extrapolate consequences. Learning to do this has been essential to my success. And that doesn't mean that I don't understand kindness or goodness or decency or anything like that. In fact, I'm highly sympathetic to the problems of others, and I'm eager to please. Oh, remembering names. Remembering names is so difficult. I've never been good with them. I remember faces, places, and events, but keeping a person's name in my brain is very difficult. If I'm introduced to someone, 5 minutes later, that person's name is gone. They just jumble up like this picture of name tags. All of them blend into nothing. And this isn't just in my personal and professional relationships. I have a hard time with names in books, movies, TV shows. I see the pictures of people in my mind, but that doesn't connect to their name. Now, remember when I said that my testing indicated that I had my attention span was short? It was terrible. Learning new names is obviously tightly connected to short-term memory. And the best way for me to remember someone's name is to create a mnemonic device in the moment, associate that person's name with something else, or repeat the person's name over and over and over again. Now, these are weird things to do in front of a person when you've just met them. This can also be really awkward when you're asked to introduce someone you were with to another person, someone that you should absolutely know the name of. So I plan ahead of social gatherings and meetings. I remind myself of people's names I know will be there. I write a note on a piece of paper or on my phone, and I keep it in my pocket. Stimulus and stress makes this far worse. So names go out the window completely in cases like that. I can even forget the name of a close friend. If someone in your team tells you that they're on the spectrum and tells you that they're experiencing too much stimulus, believe them. Help them get to a quieter place, and lower lighting can often help. Don't be offended if they can't remember their name. If they ask you to remind them of your name, just tell them. Time blindness is something that can be both a symptom of ADHD and those on the autism spectrum. When I was 12, my father was writing to the Ottawa Board of Education, trying to get additional help for me. One of the things he wrote was, Matthew has no proper sense of time. It took him very long time to understand yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He has no notion of days, years, or months, or getting anywhere on time. This is largely true. Still, I have to go overboard to make sure I have calendar and reminders set up to get me to places on time. I can't estimate how long it'll take me to get from point A to point B. So I'll use Google Maps or maps on my iPhone. And then I'll set up multiple alerts on my phone to make sure that I get to the right thing at the right time. Now, I'll say this, that being a remote worker has made it much easier on me because I can just take a look at my calendar. I struggle with deadlines, so I overcompensate and I start tasks early. When I find something interesting, however, I can hyper-focus and I might miss meals. I'll often look at the clock and wonder where the time went. So what to do? First of all, wear a watch. Smartwatches are awesome. And in fact, I wear two. Use technology that can prompt you, like alarms, Siri, Google Home, and Alexa. Have clocks in all your rooms. Use a stopwatch to time tasks that you know you'll do repeatedly, so you can intellectualize setting alerts when you should start to do a task. And then do the math backwards to the deadline to figure out when you should start, and then double that time. When I was little, I had no sense of direction. Actually, I still have no sense of direction. I would run halfway, a distance rather. I would run halfway up the front yard if I saw a car coming to avoid it. And at 12, I was still considered a hazard to myself and others because I wasn't good at judging how far something was away. My eye-hand coordination was terrible. I didn't have a sense of my own physical space. I don't really have a sense of how far a mile is or a kilometer is. And back in the 1970s and early 80s, nobody could possibly have made a connection between my short-sightedness, poor binocular vision, astigmatism, and ADHD. You see, ADD wasn't added to the DSM until 1980 and ADHD until 1987. However, many ADD and ADHD symptoms are shared by monocular vision dysfunction. This is the lack of ability to properly focus because the eyes are misaligned. So those with ADHD and ADD can present with these symptoms as well. And that in the 70s could be diagnosed with having a lazy eye. So I ended up wearing a patch over one eye for a good long time. This is all a way of saying I overcompensate because I have to in order to cope. One last bit of connected data that couldn't have been understood at the time as well is that I'm red-green colorblind, and there's a connection. Arvo Journals reports 33% of the general public has astigmatism, but 73% on the autism spectrum has it. The National Library of Medicine reports about 8% of males have color blindness, but when you look at those on the autism spectrum, that jumps to roughly 30%, over 3.5 times more prevalent. The medical community didn't even make this connection to color blindness and autism until about 2017. So I'm direction blind, spatial impairments. This is related to my dyslexia. I have troubles with left and right. If someone gives me directions to go north on First and then travel west on Green, I will get lost. I operate best with landmarks. Again, I give myself extra time to get places because if I don't, I get into trouble. The advent of the smartphone has been a blessing to me. Shortly after I moved to Colorado to start my first full-time professional job, I discovered a lump in my left testicle. That lump tripled in size over the space of about 15 days. I needed surgery and chemotherapy. And the chemo was pretty painful at times. And to this day, my hearing is impaired. I have neuropathy in my fingertips and permanent tinnitus in both ears. That chemotherapy was intense. I was in the doctor's office taking chemo through a port installed in my chest pretty much every day of the week for about 2 months. But I brought a work laptop to the clinic and I spent my days coding on an application for work. And when I got home at night, I'd spend my evenings curled up in a miserable, sweaty ball. In 2017, the European Association of Urology made a connection between the prevalence of testicular cancer and learning disabilities. The work lead's author, Dr. Mehran Ashfar, said, "We found that people with learning disabilities are not only more likely to develop testicular cancer, but they're also far more likely to die from it than the general public. And people with learning difficulties are 4 more times likely to die of testicular cancer than the general public." For me, this was another data point connecting a lot of dots. Now, I will say this. Cancer, in my case, wasn't negative on balance. It represented another step towards being less rigid. Remember when I talked about my childhood, how I was impulsive, short-tempered at times, often inflexible and obsessed with a single thing and bad with transitions? I could be impatient with people, and I would often quibble about small things and found it extremely difficult to let those things go, often to the detriment of my personal and professional relationships. However, this experience forced me to confront the fact that the small stuff doesn't matter. I learned that holding on to those kinds of trifles and letting them stress you out was counterproductive. When you're treating something that would 100% kill you otherwise, your perspective can change. Now, you don't need to go through cancer to learn this lesson. If you're feeling overly stressed by the small stuff and it causes you to argue with people, I would encourage you to take a deep breath and ascertain for yourself, does this really matter? Will your relationships be better if you breathe instead of argue? Now I'm going to give a public service announcement. For all of you guys out there that have learning disabilities, please do self-checks in the shower regularly, once a month, because this kind of cancer is relatively common in young men, but highly curable if you catch it early. When I finished high school, I wasn't ready to go to university. I wasn't mature enough. I didn't have enough self-awareness. High school had been extraordinarily difficult. And while I never failed any classes, I had a hard time concentrating, was socially extremely awkward. I didn't understand people well, and they didn't understand me. I misread intentions and was often bullied. In the 9th grade, I was taped to the football goalpost 2 feet off the ground. Later during high school, my locker was broken into, and a snake, a couple of crayfish, and a fetal pig from the biology lab were left stinking of formaldehyde in there. The stigma of junior high had followed me. I was alone, bullied, and largely without a tribe. Every success since then has been colored with, somebody's going to figure out that I'm worthless. For me, this is when imposter syndrome began. I felt happiest when I was doing things on my own, things that required repetitive actions, which meant I excelled in art classes where repetition and techniques like cross-hatching were valued. I was able to express myself in ways that were pretty bizarre, and rather than being frowned on for it, I received praise for my creativity. So I decided, with the help of my parents, to take a vocational art program for high school graduates. I worked in a coffee shop at the same time, but really I was adrift. Neither my parents nor I had any idea of what was going to come next. I half-heartedly engaged in that program and left it before the year ended. I was deeply sad. I felt like a fake, a fraud, and useless. But my father saw an advertisement in the local newspaper for a tiny liberal arts university in the eastern townships of Quebec. The school is nestled on the convergence of two rivers. It was established in 1843, with much of the architecture reflecting its affiliation with Oxford and Cambridge. When we toured the school, it was immediately clear to us that it would be perfect. The school size was only about 1,700 students. I applied in fine arts and theater. I was accepted and received several scholarships, which seemed crazy to me at the time. And the amazing thing was that my largest class was about 40 people. My smallest was around 7. And yet I started school feeling like a fraud, and I was just waiting for a teacher to call me out and for it to all fall apart. I was waiting for my peers to bully and shame me. But these things didn't happen, and I flourished. High-functioning people with ADD and ADHD can do well in the workplace, but undiagnosed, they might attribute symptoms to anxiety and depression. It can affect self-esteem. You can feel like you have character flaws that lead to feelings of shame. You can have a lack of confidence. You might get praised for how hard you work, how long you work. But part of the reason you're working long hours is to compensate for the inability to stay on task for longer periods of time. This can make you feel like a fraud. It can lead to that feeling. Someday somebody's going to figure out that I'm faking it. Now, this last story isn't really just for folks with neurodivergence. It's general advice, but it does help us. After finishing my bachelor's, I moved back to Ottawa and I worked as a lighting technician for a local theater. And I realized while doing that lighting work that I didn't want to be a theater tech for my whole life. So I enrolled in a nonprofit management program at the University of Ottawa, which led to a job with an experimental dance company. I also applied to go to grad school in Virginia to complete a Master of Fine Arts focused on arts marketing. The job was curious because it represented the first step to me becoming a software technologist. I leveraged what I learned at Le Groupe when I attended grad school. Now, this was in 1995, and I was hired to work on the website, and I glibly said, sure, I can figure that out. And I didn't have Google to Google what is a website, but I did know what the internet was because I was using Telnet to log into a crazy system called Lambda Mu, a giant free-form multi-user game. And actually, I met my wife there, and that's kind of awesome. I asked a friend on Lambda Mu what this web thing was, and he was very helpful, pointed me to some helpful information. And by reading up on the internet, I was suddenly a webmaster. I really had no idea of what I was doing, but even so, I'm sure most people were in the same boat because in 1995, there were only 23,500 websites in the world. One of the absolutely insane things that the company did that summer, remember this was 1995, was to collaborate in real time with multiple dance companies, working with a Canadian broadcasting company to do live feeds between different sites. Nobody had tried something like that before, collaboration at distance with performers, and it blew me away. And when I arrived at Virginia Tech, I explained my experience that summer to my committee. My committee was incredible, and they allowed me to gather together a coalition of different departments to experiment with bleeding-edge technology for my thesis work. So rather than researching arts administration, I produced 3 multimedia works, each layering on the previous, experimenting with the web, imagery, live-action theater, stream live feeds, and pre-recorded video. I had to learn to code, to manage people, to string together networks, and to learn video codecs. The boy that wasn't supposed to learn to read or write had transformed into a technologist. All this led to my working with the university after graduating, teaching copyright law, videography, and developing the first database-driven tourism website with the Virginia Tourism Board. That was in 1998. Never be frightened to ask for what you need and want. The worst thing that can happen is somebody can say no. Don't be frightened to do bold and crazy things. Do something that takes you completely out of your comfort zone and assume if you keep applying pressure to it, you will make it work. Be fearless and don't let the perceived consequences of failure cripple you, because the real consequence of success can be life-changing. I was afraid to start talking about my own personal mental health challenges. I was afraid to talk about my learning disabilities. My neurodivergency was something that I heavily masked, and I didn't want to be different. I didn't want to be perceived as different. I didn't want my professional career or my professional relationships to be prejudiced or destroyed because of these aspects of myself. When I was a child, through this school of hard knocks, I learned to hide this part of me. I learned that I should put them away in a safe little corner and protect those dirty little secrets. But becoming a dad changed that because I had to talk about some of these things as my daughter's advocate. And after a few years clear of cancer, my wife and I, you see, we decided that we're going to adopt that child. We've known that we wanted to be parents, and we also knew that the foster care system was full of terribly abused children who needed parents. So we adopted this five-year-old little girl, and she had had a very, very difficult first few years of her life. And a lot of her emotional problems in many ways mirror my own masked issues. I wouldn't understand my own challenges if I hadn't been confronted with hers and had to learn everything that I could about RAD, ADHD, PTSD, bipolar disorder. If it hadn't been for my daughter, I would have just continued coping, and I never would have understood my own ADHD, dyslexia. And I certainly wouldn't have come to the realization that I was on the autism spectrum. And I would never, ever have had the courage to talk about these things publicly. So, I have a few last takeaways before I pause for questions. It is estimated that 1% of the population has autism spectrum disorder. With software developers, that jumps to 4% of us, at least 4% of us that report it. I'm sure that there are many of us that don't. 4.4% of the population has ADHD, and 20% of people have dyslexia. High-functioning autists gravitate to industries like software development. You have these people, or maybe you are one of these people, in your life. And some of them are masking. So you might not even know who all of them are. So keeping this in mind, use empathy. If you're on the spectrum, you have to work twice as hard to understand how others perceive the world. And if you aren't on the spectrum, you need to work twice as hard to understand how your autist friend, colleague, or partner thinks. Make patience central to your life. Patience is a muscle that needs to be exercised. Those with ADHD and autism become irritable more easily than atypical people, and that can lead to outbreaks of anger. Practically, this means if you're neurodivergent, you need to be monitoring why you feel like you do. And if you're neurotypical, help your friend by watching out for warning signs and triggers. Kindness should be your go-to, even when you're feeling upset. Assume people are approaching a situation or a problem with good intentions, unless they prove otherwise. Be kind. Thanks very much for listening, and I'd be happy to take some questions.